pretend I wasn't even going to put all my content on YouTube, just, using really good SEO to make short clips and thinking about what people would search for, like 5 ways to pitch yourself to a newsletter, and do only that clip and then drive people to the podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Podcast Life. Today I am joined by Lauren Pacell and we are talking about podcast marketing. Lauren is a co-founder of Tink Media, which is a fantastic resource, and I recommend you all check it out if you haven't. But Lauren, we're going to just dive right in. Today I want to talk specifically about promoting around your episodes. And even more specifically, we're going to start with what should people do to promote before the episode drops?
Well, thank you for having me, but I think this is a huge problem because I thought we were here to talk about Disney World, and all of my notes are about Disney World. So I don't know. I'm just kidding.
I edit a Disney podcast. They would probably love to have you to talk about Disney World because they went for the first time, I think, last year.
I named my company after Tinkerbell, so if that gives you any idea. No, this is such a good question. And, people ask me, to talk about podcasting all the time. This is something specifically I don't think people get super granular about. So I'm really glad you wanted to talk about it. Before the episode is interesting, right? My first instinct, if I had to say one word, is you don't. And I don't know. It's complicated. And I want to explain what I mean by that because, I guess my question for you is, are you talking about the first episode of a podcast ever, or the first episode, or just every episode?
I'm thinking along the lines of every episode because I majored in music industry. So coming from the music world, there's always this build up to releases. And
right.
Obviously with a podcast, it's not quite the same as releasing a full album because a lot of podcasts are ongoing. Sure, you can think of mini series in the same way, which I think is actually really smart. But podcasts don't really have singles in the way that an album does to promote that something's coming. So a lot of what I've seen is just like, hey, we have a new episode tomorrow. Here's who's on it. Here is what it's about, what have you. And I'm just really curious if there's a better way to do that. Like, do you have everything done far enough in advance, which I'm guilty of not having everything done far enough in advance to necessarily do this. But do you put out like a little teaser clip with your guest, or just sort of things like that to let people know what's coming next on the podcast?
Okay. Well, I would say, is it breaking news? Is this so time sensitive that people have to know that it's, oh my gosh, this just happened. We're covering this on the podcast tomorrow. I think that could go out to your social networks, maybe your newsletter subscribers, maybe if it was like breaking. And then, if it's the first episode ever, or I loved how you called them singles. Like if it's the first episode ever or the first episode of a new season, oh my gosh, I love it when podcasters do mini seasons because, or miniseries, because that gives me something to grab onto. That's a reason to celebrate. And that is a reason to do some marketing around it. But if it's not any of those things, it's not, I don't even think I would ever do anything about it, because the most podcast listeners, they're going to forget that in 2 seconds, unless it's humongous news or something. So until there's something for my audience to listen to, I don't even want to tell them about it. When there's something for them to listen to, that's when I think it really begins. If it's your first episode of the show or the series or the season, then that's where I really do think it's when you send the press releases. It's when you email people. It is when you pitch yourself to the apps. It's maybe when you're trying to get on podcasts to talk about it. It's when everything in your newsletter comes out. I would say, if you want, I think it's kind of cool, like, I'm sitting here with my cat Monty. If your next interview was going to be with my cat Monty, which by the way would be incredible. Think about it. His schedule is wide open. If at the end of this interview you said, hey, next time we're going to be talking to Lauren's cat Monty. So maybe like at the end of your episode, if you know what is in advance, then maybe tease that. So then it reminds people, oh my gosh, I really want to hear that. But I don't think, I don't think that no one ever has, if people are pretending to have tons of stuff ready in advance, I think a lot of those people are not telling the truth. I feel like it's very common not to have things done until the very last second. So that's okay. Um, if you ever do want to send advance stuff though, like it's fine that it's not perfect. But if you're trying to solve the problem for what am I doing then in this time, right? Which I guess is the crucial problem. It's like if you have a backlog, juice the backlog. There are so many exciting things you can do with the backlog. You could make, a thing on your website, a URL on your website that's like website/start here and make starter packs for people. I'm sure that there's things that pop up all the time. If you've only posted something on your social channels once for a great episode, that means probably no one saw it, like go back to those things, mix it up. I even think, making a mini trailer for a really, really, really great episode you have is a good idea. Um, I would say spend most of the time making the most of what is already been published because I'm sure there's a lot of great stuff out there.
That's perfect because I have seen in the music world a lot. It's like, don't advertise your single, just put out your single. And I think, that's a similar mindset to get into with each of your episodes. So then the question becomes, what should people be doing day of and then after the episode is published to sort of keep that conversation about it going?
I do see a lot of social media posts. This episode is here. We can start with social media. I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm sure your listeners have heard this. Social media doesn't generally drive downloads. There's a lot of great things about social media. That's why when I get a client, I want to know what their goal is first. And sometimes I ask podcasters that and they have to think about it. And I think, oh my goodness, it seems like the biggest deal to figure out what your goal is first. Because if your goal is to go viral on TikTok or just to grow your Instagram account, then that's awesome. And you should be dedicating time to your social media. Social media is not completely worthless, but I'm trying to grow download numbers in my job. So I'm not seeing the conversion rate. I'm seeing a higher conversion rate in other places. So I'd rather spend my time on those other places. So there's definitely things to do for social. I definitely have advice about it. And it's definitely good to be on some handles, checking to make sure if people are tagging, interacting, and reminding people when an episode is out. So I would say on social, remind people that the episode is out. I'm a big fan of newsletters. I see higher conversion on newsletters. I think it's okay to have first of all, I think everyone should have a newsletter for their podcast. And even if you are planning a podcast, start a newsletter because you don't own your Apple Podcasts listeners. They could stop listening and you have no idea where they went, but you can own your newsletter subscribers. And it also is helpful in partnerships. It's an asset. You can say, I'm also going to mention, if you have me on your podcast, I'll put it in my newsletter. That's just very interesting or a very good asset to have. So start the newsletter. You don't have to do, entire, extra portions of content. You could just say, here's the new episode is here. Maybe it could include show notes, extra, show notes or a transcript. I think the best podcast newsletters someone could enjoy on completely separately. That's the best way to do it. But just having the newsletter is really good for promotion. So I would recommend doing that. But what I would spend more time doing that I'm not seeing people doing is, emailing people in your community and pitching yourself to podcast newsletters, pitching the episode to podcast newsletters. So what I would do, make a list of the podcast newsletters and if there's a episode that you could do this for every single episode. Go through, what? I've never thought of this before. This is what I would do. I would make a spreadsheet or like a Google sheet and put a list of all the podcast newsletters and then make columns. Is this one interested in tech? Is this one interested in comedy? Is this one Pod the North, which is only Canadian? Is this, you can learn about all the podcast newsletters. So then if you're pitching to the right place. Don't just email every single one. James Cridland is very interested in technology and brand new things. Mm-hmm. I am interested in podcasts about Disney and Jesus and, Jay Dilla. So you have to know that about me. That can be in my column, so then when your Jay Dilla episode comes out, you would know to pitch me. And so it's a good pitch. So then every single episode, you could look at your chart and be like, okay, I'm going to pitch in this one to Lauren. And sending me no PDFs, no press releases, please, just a letter. Spend time sending notes and saying, and you know what? You could send a blast that will not hit anyone. Blasting is in PR what we call spray and pray, and it doesn't work. And that's why social media doesn't really work. It's a spray and pray. You're spraying it out there and praying that someone responds. Make a really small list. At Tink, we spend 20 minutes on every single pitch letter because that's how long it takes to write a good letter. You're listening, you're thinking, you're making connections. So if you're writing to a podcast newsletter, you're saying, I really think you'll like this. If you're sending the episode to another podcast, you're saying, this seems like a good vibe match to you. I thought you might like to hear it because I like your work. Is there something we can do together? Do you want to swap the episode? If I sent you this trailer, could you do a trailer, a 30-second trailer for the episode, and I could do something for you? And by the way, I started a newsletter. I'll also talk about you in my newsletter. This is all about finding these podcast partnership and podcast friendships. So even if you only send 2 letters, I think that's better than doing a bunch of social media blasts because these things take more time, but they have a higher ROI.
Absolutely agreed. And that's the approach I've been taking just with getting guests on this podcast. We've crossed paths before, and I've followed Tink Media for pretty much since the start of it, I believe.
Oh my goodness.
And so I was like, I don't have a boilerplate like, hey, do you want to be a guest on this podcast? I'm trying to tailor them to the people I'm trying to get on. And I started with people I had already interacted with, friends I know who work on podcasts, and then I've sort of slowly branched out from there. And I think that's also a great place to start too. If you have other friends who have podcasts that are similar in subject matter to you, just start with them, do cross promotion. See if they have a newsletter, see what's going on in your circle first. And then usually those people know people, and that helps you expand as well. And you mentioned social media, Instagram, TikTok. So that leads me to my next question. Do you think podcasts have to have video in order to be able to successfully do promotion?
I mean, this is the question of the year. And it's funny because I feel like I have a lot of clients that are like, wait a second, I get into podcasts because I don't want to be on video. And that's the whole point. And I hear that. And also, I am an audio person. I am obsessed with audio. I think a lot of the uptick in video is taking away from my audio experience. A podcast that I love and listen to every day has started video. And now they're doing things like making references to things that I can't see. And it's making me upset. So can you tell that I'm coming into this question hot? Can you tell that I'm biased like everyone is? I say you don't have to. And I think the reason I say that is because there's nothing worse than someone doing something when they really don't want to. And if you don't want to, and it's just not right for every podcast. I think there are some podcasts it's right for. And I think it makes sense for people that are really comfortable on camera and have the kind of show that's like maybe a chat show. As long as they're keeping in mind their audio listeners also. Mm-hmm. But, there's a lot of shows like investigation shows and narrative shows that, what am I going to tell those people to do? Promoting, I think, is similar too. It's like, am I going to tell someone to start a YouTube channel just so they can promote their investigative, podcast?
Yeah.
I would say you can't do everything. I would say skip it. And also, I was working in media in, I forget what year that was, 2016, when Facebook promised us that our video content was going to be driving everything. And all the media companies hired entire video teams. And then Facebook said, just kidding. And all of those teams got fired. This kind of thing happens. I would say the best and most important thing with everything you do in marketing is prioritize what you care about and what your listeners care about. And because you can't prioritize everything. So prioritize that stuff and don't worry about the rest of the stuff. And I hope that question wasn't too vague, but how do you feel about this question?
I struggled with this because I had actually done just a YouTube channel previously, and I was talking about like comics, horror stuff, and I got terrible comments and it just like made me stop doing it for a while. So when I was thinking about starting this podcast, one of the guys I work with, Jesse Cannon, who was the first guest on this podcast, he was like, you really should do video for it. And I was so resistant to it because of my previous YouTube experience. But the reason I ultimately ended up doing it for this podcast, because I do agree with you, it does not work for every podcast. It works for chat type shows or something like this where you're trying to teach people things. And that is the biggest reason why I ultimately decided to just do video. But as you can see, it's not like some big fancy production. I'm literally just recording with my phone and the same microphone I would have been using for audio. So once I also simplified that, because before when I was doing YouTube, I tried to get like way too into it with like a fancy camera and all this stuff. And I just got frustrated with the technical aspect of it as well. Even though I could do it, I do like the technical side of things, but a lot of people don't. And that is totally fine. And it is truly just easier to turn on a microphone, or if you have one that doesn't turn on and you just plug it up, there's that. But I typically agree that you do not have to have video. It is becoming more common for these types of shows, chat shows, and I'm honestly not going to complain about it because I get paid to edit them. So, and because they're adding video, I get to charge more. So,
Yeah.
for me, it's kind of a two-sided thing as someone who freelances and also makes my own podcast. But because, like I said, this is educational, that's ultimately why I decided to do this. Because even if someone is only seeing an Instagram reel, if that 1 minute Instagram reel helps them realize how to do something with their podcast, that's good enough for me. I don't necessarily need every single person who comes across this podcast to listen to every single episode, right? That's not the goal of it. The goal is to help people.
Yeah. I will say, like, here's to the people that have a podcast that's the right kind of podcast. They love video. They're comfortable on video. I do think there's, for promotion, so many great things to do because of YouTube search engine. It is an amazing search engine. So if I'm even just thinking, I'm not even pretend I wasn't even going to put all my content on YouTube, just, using really good SEO to make short clips and thinking about what people would search for, like 5 ways to pitch yourself to a newsletter and do only that clip and then drive people to the podcast. So I do think that there's really exciting things to do but that's a lot of work, because it's the other thing I'm always thinking about. It's a luxury to do video too. So I think a lot of times podcasters who might not even have the luxury are worrying about it. And I just want to get everyone to stop worrying about it.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world. It's okay.
One of my goals with this show too is just to be like fully transparent about my process. I have released shorts from one episode, the very first episode, and I just have not had the time to go through and find the clips. And yes, you can have AI do this. There are plenty of services you can pay for. I did use one for the first episode and I found myself still tweaking it because I'm like, I feel like there's something that's just missing here, or there was a weird cut, so then the audio sounded weird. So AI is very helpful, not necessarily perfect. So it does still need some oversight, in my opinion. But for me, it was just like, I chose to do this podcast every other week because I knew doing video would increase the amount of time I was spending on it. And two, I'm still not comfortable on video. So I knew it would also take me longer to just like do the clips and figure everything out and just try to find a way to be more comfortable with it. So there are a lot of reasons for and against video, in my opinion. And I think it's just one of those things where you also have to be honest with yourself about how much time you have.
I like, though, that you figured that out, because I feel like sometimes people don't know what to do and they don't have a checklist. I think having a checklist is good.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm always telling people, like, maybe pick 3 things to do because you want to avoid being on a hamster wheel. I think a lot of podcasters are like, wait, but I just finished this episode. I have to start thinking about the next one. I can't spend this whole 2 weeks promoting that thing. So like thinking of like, when I'm talking to my clients, I'm like, okay, let's look through our tool kit. there's social media, there's newsletters, there's pitching yourself. Let's pick 3 of those things and just worry about those, and then move on and worry about the next episode, and pick things that that you're comfortable with, that you've noticed work. You can always change them and then move on, and don't worry about it ever again.
Yeah. And at the time we were recording this last week, I had put out a solo episode, and typically I have the newsletter go out the day after the episode, and just life happened, and that did not happen. And
Life
you know what?
happens.
Sometimes that is okay. I do my very best to just be consistent with something, whether it's weekly or, like I said, with this, every other week. So I kind of beat myself up when I miss things like that. But at the same time, I'm just like, well, this is still new, and no one's like, hey, where was the newsletter? Like, why didn't you get that out? So I'm like, you know what? It's okay to give yourself a little grace every now and then. But Lauren, just last question here. Are there any final tips from you on how to market your episodes specifically?
Well, I would say definitely, if there's a big episode coming out, don't forget to pitch it to the apps. I know that, Apple Podcasts is really hard to get, and I think it might intimidate people, but you should definitely have a strategy. I'll say 2 little tips when you're using the Apple Podcasts form, which I can send to you, you can add in the show notes, and I'm sure you have it. But there's a place that says which region, and a lot of people put the US or Canada, wherever they're podcasting from. I would look at your data and figure out where other countries, it's easier to get featured in other countries. So submit yourself to another country. And also there's a field that said, what is your marketing plan? They don't really mean what is your marketing plan for the whole show or for that episode. Even they're saying, how would you market Apple Podcasts? So I'm going to drive people to Apple Podcasts. I'm going to put the Apple Podcast button is on my website. So being really strategic and taking time, not with every episode, be really selective. But also I want to say, submit to the other apps. There's many more apps that are much smaller, and you have a
Yeah.
much better chance. So don't just focus on Apple every time. There's other ones. The Pocket Casts is my app of choice, and they have a great newsletter where they send out 1 email a month that says, hey, we're looking to feature this kind of show. Just email us back if you have that kind of show. And it's one person who's wonderful reading all of those and featuring them in the Pocket Cast app.
Mhm.
So I would say, as long, as well as pitching yourself to newsletters, and just sending good, not pitch letters, but emails, notes, as well as doing that, don't forget about the apps.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.